All right, Derek, let's talk about one of the biggest hurdles in the real estate transaction, and that is the appraisal.
Absolutely. The appraisal is going to be one of the biggest obstacles that you have to overcome, and it's one of those things that is going to be a component in most real estate transactions.
Yep.
And it's important to understand what its role is in the process and really how to prepare for it.
Yeah, and it's kind of like the unknown when it's when you don't really know all the details about it. It can be really scary just to hear that word, right? So today we're going to break down what the appraisal is and a few more facts about it.
Absolutely, because it can be confusing. There's a lot of confusion out there about appraisals. Can I talk to the appraiser, for example? Should I prepare for the appraisal? So we're going to dive deep into that today.
Yep. Welcome to the Real Estate Game Plan Podcast, where we bring you inspiration, actionable steps, and knowledge to build your game plan to take your real estate business to the next level. My name is Demo.
And I'm Derek, and we are licensed real estate brokers and your hosts for this podcast. Let's get started.
Okay, Derek, so the appraisal comes back, and the appraisal is lower than what's agreed upon on the purchase and sell agreement. From the buyer's standpoint, what do they do? What's typical? And from the buyer agent standpoint, how involved are they?
Right. That's a good question. So important to keep in mind the buyer is the one who paid for the appraisal. The lender is the one who ordered that or maybe went through appraisal management company, an AMC. And it's really in the buyer's court at that point. They may choose to do nothing. Mm-hmm. They may ask for a reduction in sales price. They may choose to pay the difference in some cases. But the buyer is the one who could go to the lender and say, I want to challenge this appraisal. Now, most lenders are going to have an appraisal dispute process, maybe a little bit of paperwork to fill out. If that route is what's taken, it would be really important to be able to back up the value that you think is there. For example, CMA, comparative market analysis. Buyer's agent pulled one likely whenever the buyer made an offer. Listing agent may be able to help as well because the listing agent likely pulled comps whenever they went to list the property. It may even be that the seller paid for a pre-listing appraisal and there's already an appraisal that backs it up. But if it's going to be challenged, it would need to be a decision made between the buyer and the lender. And I would be prepared to back up why you think the value should be higher.
So if the buyer wants to go to the seller and say, hey, your home's not worth what we all agreed at one point that we thought it was worth based on the appraisal, are there any documents that the buyer can fill out officially to make that happen, make that request happen?
Absolutely. So an amendment could be proposed to request a reduction in the sales price as a direct result of that lower appraisal. And in that case, I would expect to provide a copy of that appraisal to the seller.
Sure. So I think we've all heard some stories about the buyer's agent, even though the appraisal is technically paid for and owned by the buyer, right? But that they are not willing to share that information with the listing agent, but yet the listing agent receives an amendment to reduce sales price. What's your recommendation there for the listing side?
Well, contractually, at least, most of the time the buyer is going to be required to provide a copy of the appraisal to the seller if they're requesting a reduction in sales price. Sounds pretty fair to me. So I would not recommend a seller, sign off on an amendment to change the sales price or agree to any lender appraisal, appraiser required repairs too. I'll just throw that in there without actually seeing that there is a lower price or there are repairs required.
So ultimately, buyer sends over amendment to reduce sales price. Seller receives it, says, we agree to reduce the sales price, or we disagree, we're not budging, or let's negotiate. Are those kind of the three options there?
Those are the three options, and a lot of that is going to depend on the type of financing that the buyer has, aka what the contract says. There are certain types of financing, for example, conventional, that if the property comes back for an appraisal lower than the contract purchase price, the buyer has an opportunity to request an amendment to reduce the price. They don't have to. Again, they may choose to just pay the difference. Coming out of extreme markets, when you're in an extreme market, you see more of that as a symptom. But typically a buyer is going to request the reduction. Now, if the seller doesn't agree to reduce, contractually, they usually have a right to terminate. But as always, carefully review the terms of your contract. But that in contrast to FHA or VA, because of the amendatory clause that we've talked about in the past, usually buyers have a right to they can certainly request an amendment to reduce the price, but they may also just have a blanket opportunity to actually walk away if they choose to.
So let's take it one more step. Seller says, no, I'm not reducing the sales price. Buyer says, I only want you to reduce the sales price. They disagree. They say, we're done. What happens? Earnest money? What happens with anything there?
Usually the buyer will have an appraisal contingency in their financing exhibit or baked into the contract somewhere. And so if the seller doesn't agree to reduce the price, what's most likely going to happen is the buyer is going to terminate the contract, and they're usually entitled to a return of their earnest money.
Gotcha. Let's talk time frames. Your buyer is putting in an offer. What does the buyer's agent put typically in for the period of time for an appraisal contingency, number of days for that in the contract?
Right. When it is more of a buyer's market, we typically see 20 to 25 days. Now, when you're in an extreme seller's market or in a seller's market, you're going to see something like 10 to 15 days. And you will hear the phrase rush appraisal mentioned more. And buyers can pay a little extra and have an appraisal rushed through, expedited through the system. As a good rule of thumb, I would check with the lender just to see, because every lender's different. And just depending on how much traffic is coming through at that time.
Yeah. What about once it goes binding, is there anything that the buyer's agent needs to do regarding this appraisal contingency time frame?
Well, really important to distribute copies of the binding agreement to all of the parties, including the lender. If you go binding, for example, Friday morning, and the lender doesn't get a copy of the contract until 3 p.m. on Monday, there's several days that have been lost. And so if that lender does review that agreement and maybe an amendment is needed, maybe to add a little extra time for the appraisal contingency, it sure would have been a lot nicer to have known on Friday than Monday.
Yeah, definitely time is of the essence when it comes to that. Right. Who orders the appraisal, and is there a copy of it anywhere?
So the lender will actually be the party who will order the appraisal, or they may go through a appraisal management company, an AMC, and the buyer will receive a copy of it. The buyer's the one who's paying for it. It will be their appraisal report.
Okay. And buyer's agent, listing agent, seller, all of them can speak to the appraiser, right?
Yes, they can all speak to the appraiser. A lot of misinformation out there amongst some, thinking that we cannot speak to the appraiser, but you actually can. Now, of course, you can't bribe, you can't intimidate, but you absolutely can communicate with them.
Yeah, don't bring any Chick-fil-A gift cards with you to the appraisal. That's
probably not the best idea. How do we prepare our client for the appraisal?
Well, from the listing side, if you're representing the seller, you want to prepare your client by saying, listen, I know we are under contract. I know that we had the property in hotel-like condition when we took pictures, and then now you're living back in the property. But this is the one more time we want to get that property as close to that picture hotel-like quality that we had when we took the initial pictures for your listing. Because this appraiser is going to come in for the first time to this property only with the information that's provided, like contract and things like that. And we want them to see this property in all of its brilliance and beauty. We want to see all of the great choice of colors that you put on the wall when you repaint it, and all of the updates that you've done to this property without it being overwhelmed, essentially through like the eyes of a buyer. And so that is the conversation I would have with the seller, is just to say, let's do what we need to do this weekend. The appraiser's coming Thursday, Wednesday, Tuesday. Let's see if we can get this place as tidy as possible, just for that appraiser to come through and take a look at the property.
Excellent advice. And I love the hotel-like condition.
Yes.
So can real estate agents speak to the appraiser?
Directly to the appraiser? Answer, yes. You most certainly can speak directly to the appraiser. The best way to start that conversation is when the appraiser calls and says, hey, I'm going to appraise 123 Main Street on Thursday. Just need the CBS code or something like that from the lockbox, or is there a lockbox? You as the agent saying, yes, I'm happy to meet you at Thursday at 1, or if that doesn't work for your schedule, figure out something that does work, but meet that appraiser on site. So number one, yes, you can chat with them. And then the follow-up question is,
what kind of information should we actually prepare for the appraiser?
Exactly. And we call it an appraiser's packet, just to have some great information that you can provide to that appraiser. Some things like the CMA that you use to price that property, or one of that day, maybe the day before that appraisal actually happens, you do a CMA to show them what's happening in that neighborhood to justify the contract price or the price that you listed it at, whichever one may be higher there. And also, we've heard some great tips in the industry of the appraisal world of providing information on bad comps. So maybe a property undersold, hard to believe, but maybe it undersold. And so why did it undersell? Does it back up to a main road or a power plant or something like that? The appraiser may not have that piece of information readily available, and you might have it. So including things like that, proximity to commercial, schools, restaurants, shopping, things like that might be of importance. But really just detailing all of that information on one concise page is great information to meet the appraiser at the property and then give them that appraiser packet.
Absolutely. Was there multiple offers?
Multiple offers, great.
But I love the bad comps, because if there was a short sale, if there was a foreclosure, and there's a concern that the seller has or maybe the agent has, go ahead and highlight that one and explain why that's not a good comp.
Yeah, and talk to your sellers, because there's a lot of information inside of the neighborhood that might not be available on the MLS. So, hey, that property actually undersold because they had a certain situation going on between them where they had to sell really quickly, right? So maybe that influenced the low price of that comp, and you don't want that comp to affect your house that you're selling.
Absolutely.
Derek, does the type of financing that the buyer's receiving affect anything in the appraisal process?
Yes, because if it's conventional versus FHA or VA, FHA and VA appraisers are going to be looking at also safety and health. They're going to be looking at big components. For example, if it's FHA and there's chipping paint, or maybe the roof is at the end of its life expectancy, or
appliances, right?
Appliances or HVAC. So all of those things, more of a big picture, I feel like is going to be taken into account when it's FHA or VA versus when it's conventional.
Gotcha. We hope this information about appraisals was helpful for you. We'll catch you on the next episode. You've been listening to the Real Estate Game Plan podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube and leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you for listening.